All right, so now we're going to talk about soil amendments in action. And a lot of this stuff will be reviewed, but we'll get in a little more depth as far as the composting process goes.
So our learning objectives are to describe the composting methods commonly used on farms, demonstrate proper use of a composting thermometer. We talk a lot about temperatures, but don't actually tell you how to take a temperature in this module we just went through. So we're going to show you how to use that compost thermometer that you all have now. Identify when minimum composting standards have not been achieved for microbiological safety. Basically show you how to use your compost thermometer. Again, and determine appropriate standards for soil amendments to mitigate foodborne pathogen risk. And again, prepare a record and actually show you some examples of records that you can actually use on your farms. And again, you have all those records on the Jump Drive that you can augment since they're in a Word document.
So what occurs during that composting process? So first of all, when you make that pile and get it up to size, and a compost pile, oftentimes we see pictures of windrows that are going to be very long and very big. But a little 3x3 pile is fine to start out with. You know, it's all a matter of scale, so whatever makes sense for you and how much material you have to work with. But what we want to see is once that pile is made, we want to see that temperature ramping up, and then you see this thermophilic phase right here. And that's when we're going to get up to the 131 or above that temperature for those days. You can see here it was in that thermophilic days for the thermophilic phase for 15 days, which is what we want if it's in a pile that we're aerating. And then it's going to go through that curing phase or the mesophilic phase, and that temperature is going to slowly come down. But this is really the critical part here, that we want to make sure we're maintaining that temperature above 131 for that 15-day time period.
So in the first little point of our pile, where we haven't quite reached that thermophilic phase, it's called the initial mesophilic phase. You have rapid growth of mesophilic bacteria, and mesophilic bacteria is just a term that we commonly use for the organisms that grow at roughly our body temperature. They like kind of, meso means middle and phile means loving, so they're middle loving temperature-wise. And again, things that can grow here are going to be bacteria, also many fungi, yeast, molds as well, will also grow in this. And they'll be utilizing sugar that's present and starch in breaking down, especially with the fungi. They can pretty easily break down starch that's present into simple sugars for our bacteria to use later on. In our thermophilic phase, we actually transition to thermophilic bacteria. And essentially, thermophilic bacteria are typically those bacteria that can grow at 110 on upwards. And they're the bacteria that can really tolerate the warmest temperature. So they're definitely going to be predominating in that phase where we're actually getting death. The thing that's important to know is that no foodborne pathogens are categorized as thermophiles, and therefore we're only going to have good microbiota in there that, from a foodborne pathogen standpoint, being able to even grow during that phase. Again, you're going to have breakdown of proteins, fats, and some of our more complex carbohydrates like hemicellulose and cellulose. Again, we have that, after we go through that thermophilic phase, that final curing phase, where we have degradation of lignin and any other remaining compounds during that curing final phase.
So the keys to composting, the first one is your carbon to nitrogen ratio, and generally we want to target between 25:1 and 40:1, and that basically we don't have a good way to measure our carbon-nitrogen ratio, but I often say greens to browns, browns to greens. So we want to make sure that we're getting a good mix in there, and so we can get that carbon and nitrogen ratio. And then we want to make sure that we're getting that aeration in the pile, because that air is going to help with that decomposition. So we want to make sure we're maintaining that air. And then the moisture content. We talked about that before lunch, that we want that wet sponge, wrung out wet sponge feel, and we're targeting about 50 to 60% moisture content. So again, we're not going to actually measure the moisture content, but if you have that damp but not overly saturated feeling. That's what we're going for. And then we're getting the temperature 90 to 140 degrees for quality, but again for food safety, we're targeting above that 131 degrees. And then the surface area. The smaller the size of your pile, of course, the faster that process is going to be. And then porosity. That space is going to allow for the airflow to go through and increase microbial growth. And the nutrients, those spaces that allow for the air and the microbial growth.
So you get faster breakdown, basically,
Okay.
and better nutrient availability in that finished compost.
There we go. Okay.
What do you recommend for the carbon?
Wood chips or little branches or something like that. So, leaf litter, what do we recommend for the carbon? And that would be the brown. So the leaf litter, you don't want to get too many leaves in there because they're hard to break down over time. And same thing for wood chips. But yeah, anything that's actually brown.
Great. And this is just an example. Annette had mentioned in our previous talk that a lot of times aerated static piles are more commonly found in large operations. And this is just an example where you can see the forced air going into these static piles. And again, since you're forcing the air through, you are more likely to get homogeneous temperature distribution throughout those windrow piles, even on the top where it's harder to maintain that temperature. And again, we're always looking for 131.
And an
for 3 days.
interesting party fact, we toured the largest composting facility in the United States, which is up in Washington State. And Gore-Tex, they use Gore-Tex tarps for their composting. Amazingly huge system that they run, but it looks a lot like this, only on a very, very large scale. And that's another use of that Gore-Tex because the water doesn't get through the Gore-Tex, so it doesn't leach into the pile, and that's why they use it. But Gore has a lot of composting technology in addition to your raincoat. So the other one that we see more commonly is the turn composting, and it's generally on a smaller scale. This one is showing a windrow turner, and it's this implement here on the right-hand side, and it will automatically go through and turn that pile for you. You can do it with a pitchfork. It's a lot more labor intensive, of course, but we want to make sure we have that minimum temperature of 131 for that 15 days and do 5 turnings within that time period, and then follow it with the curing step.
So, again, I hope you're not able to go to sleep tonight without knowing what the minimal temperature is for composting. But you're trying to achieve that 131 degrees Fahrenheit. And at that temperature, we need to maintain it for 3 days so that we actually get inactivation of those foodborne pathogens that we're concerned with. Again, that aeration really helps drive those thermophilic bacteria and helping them maintain breakdown of that material to help you maintain that temperature. So aeration is always going to help where you can incorporate it. And there's one reason why turning your pile is going to be key, especially on your smaller systems, even though it may be time intensive.
Oh,
No, you're
you
fine.
done? John?
Question. On the temperature, in addition to killing the pathogens, is that adequate to kill weed seed?
Yes. The question was, is that temperature, in addition to killing the pathogens, adequate to kill the weed seed? And yes, it is.
So if you have a small window, that 3 by 3, and you put it in there, and you don't turn it till day 5, when does the 131 degree temperature start?
Okay, so the question is, if you have your 3 by 3 windrow and you don't start turning it until day 5, when does your 131 degree temperature start? You should be taking the temperature of your pile daily so you know when you're reaching that temperature. And then that's the start of your 15-day window. And within that 15-day window, you want to turn it 5 times. So ideally, that would be like every couple of days. So you're going to make sure that all that entire pile has received that 131 degree temperature during that thermophilic phase. So you wouldn't necessarily space it out at 0 at the first day that you're at that 131 temperature, but probably every couple days. So you make sure you get those turnings in and all of that pile has received the 131. If you wait till day 15 to turn it, it's probably starting to come down and it's not necessarily going to have the effect as if you would have turned it in earlier. So.
Yeah, without the air present, you're really going to retard the growth of those thermophiles, and they're going to start to die out. And without them actually breaking down the material there, then you're not going to maintain.
You're not going to get that temperature. Yeah, so you want to make sure that you're turning it to keep that air in there and keep them going. If you neglect that pile, that temperature is going to go down pretty quick. And that's why if you have an old pile of manure, it might have reached some sort of temperature, but if nothing happened to it and you just kept stacking things on it, those thermophilic bacteria weren't proliferating and surviving and all of that good stuff.
So if you have like a slow burning pile that,
Yeah.
say you're like a really lazy composter,
Uh-huh.
you're probably gonna have weeds in your finished compost when it finally is ready.
So the question was, if you're a lazy composter and you're not turning that pile, are you going to have weeds in that compost because it's not really going to be ready at the end? Yeah, if you're not turning it, you could have weeds or you could have pathogens. We have a lot of soil-borne pathogens, like southern blight's a great one in our area. That's very persistent in the soil. It has those overwintering bodies, the sclerotia, that look like little rat pellets or something. And those can survive all sorts of cold temperature. That's why they survive from year to year. They can also survive fairly warm temperature. So if you're not getting them into that pile and getting them to that really hot temperature, you're looking to put things back on your field that are going to cause you all sorts of plant production problems, even if you don't have a food safety issue. So really it behooves you to be a good composter if that's one of your main methods that you're putting back in your field, because none of us need any more weeds in our field, and we don't need any soil-borne diseases, especially if you didn't necessarily have them before. If you're getting compost from somebody else that's a lazy composter and they put all their old tomato plants in that had those nice sclerotia on there and they didn't compost properly, now you have a soil-borne disease problem that's going to last you for years. So yeah, it's important from a plant production and from a food safety side. It's again the double whammy, and we'll talk about that again. Chemical hazards. So as we already mentioned with the herbicides, many chemicals will not degrade during that composting process, and they may be distributed into your soil where they can be taken up by your plants. So again, we don't want the herbicides in anything we're putting on, those aminopyrrolate and clopyrrolate class herbicides, and arsenic in broiler litter is another one that can be a concern.
Yeah, and that's just an additive that was actually in the broiler litter that just would make it through the GI tract of the poultry. So it was naturally found in the pellets when they were made. So, as we've already said, it's not just those foodborne pathogens to think of. There's also the production risks that come along if you aren't reaching that thermophilic phase and being a lazy composter. So you're going to have a risk of a net just covered of having those plant pathogens surviving. Again, as she was saying, a lot of times it's a 2-for-1. What you're doing for food safety, you're also going to get the benefit of inactivating those plant pathogens that are going to decrease your production. Again, weed seed, you're going to reach those temperatures where you're going to inactivate them so they're not going to be able to germinate when you put that compost onto your fields.
So this is a picture of a red root pigweed, a very common weed in Tennessee and pretty much everywhere. And one red root pigweed, which we never usually have one in the field, right, can produce 100 to 600,000 seed off of one plant. So if you're not composting this, even if all those seeds aren't viable, even if only half of them are viable, that is a lot of pigweed that you could be putting back in your field. That's why this is so important.
So you may be asking yourself, how do I check the temperature of compost? So we're actually going to do a hands-on demonstration activity for you here at the very end, but just to talk a little bit about compost thermometers. As you can tell, they differ from a normal thermometer. If they're long enough, you can actually insert them into your compost pile and get a reading with these thermometers. They're also what you call, they're not tip sensitive, meaning that you actually have a dial in here that expands or contracts based upon the temperature that this probe is exposed to. And you actually will notice that on these, there's a tiny dot where it shows you where the sensing end of this thermometer is. So, you know, just sticking it barely in is not going to tell you what the temperature is here. It's going to tell you what the temperature is right here. So that's another thing just to keep in mind, especially if you're trying to get the temperature as you move outwards in your pile and know where you're at if you're trying to use a static system. It's where this tiny dot is. Otherwise, this one's actually marked with readings of steady or inactive and hot. And you'll notice you actually want to be in the hot zone for
You
this
do.
one, to be inactivating foodborne pathogens and be in that thermophilic phase. So you'll be able to have pretty good gradations there to monitor your temperature, but it's nothing more than just reading that dial. So again, use this composting thermometer. Again, it's not going to be like your normal thermometer in that it does have this long stem. And then again, take temperatures at multiple places throughout your pile, and from the interior of the pile where you're going to be the warmest, going towards that surface. It's especially important for using a static system that you document you're getting that temperature all throughout the pile. That's why many people are turning. In the case where you're turning the pile every 3 days, then you're going to basically be distributing what's on the outside inwards and getting killed throughout that pile.
And it's no coincidence that we did this workshop right before Thanksgiving, because it'll double as a turkey thermometer.
One heck of a turkey.
Just kidding about that. All right, so reducing risk during application, the steps you should take to reduce risk. Again, I think we've covered these, but we want to preferentially apply those soil amendments containing manure to crops. Say it with me. Not intended for fresh consumption. We have to tell you a few more times before you get interactive here or something. Maximize the time between your application and harvest. Do not contact the edible portion of the crop. Do not side dress with raw manure, and minimize the risk to produce crops if you're field spreading your manure.
Yeah.
So, if it's, when you're saying soil amendments, even after it's been composted, first apply soil amendments containing manure to crops not intended for fresh consumption.
No, if it's been properly composted, 0-day application window. So you can apply it and harvest. If it's properly, with that scientifically validated method, if it's composted properly, no, it doesn't.
You're talking about
Yeah, we're talking about
non-composted
manure.
first.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, we're talking about raw manure there.
Okay.
Yep.
So, again, just trying to hit on the high points of what we've already covered. Right now, we don't have any scientific standards. I would say the jury's very much still out on how much risk is posed by untreated raw manure. And in essence, you have a lot of people who are very adamant about using it, don't want to go through the cost of composting. So our best recommendations would be is to try to only apply that in fields where you're going to be rotating in crops that are going to go through a cooking step prior to consumption would be our best recommendation for you. Again, we can always lean on the 90 and 120 days we'll hit on here in the next slide one more time. But it's key to really acknowledge that always just assume that raw manure is going to be containing foodborne pathogens. Again, for any treated soil amendments, so once you go through a composting process, you're reaching that 131 for at least 3 days all throughout the pile. And so in a turning system, you're doing that 5 times over to make sure you get that temperature all throughout the pile. It's 0 days, so you could apply it and then harvest all within that same day if you choose to.
And again, the National Organic Program has the standards that we go by as of right now until the FDA gets more information, and that could change in the future. But for now, it's that 120-day rule for crops where the edible portion is going to touch the soil. If the crop does not touch the soil, a vine crop up off the ground like a tomato, a pepper, an eggplant, it's a 90-day application interval.
Again, you're probably thinking this is like deja vu, but just trying to hit on the high points of what was in the last one and also give you a few examples here at the very end. Honestly, the type and source and when you're applying them is key to documentation, but what's required is actually when you're applying a a raw manure, and when it's applied, what fields it's applied to, what the date is, in addition to the fact of if you're going through a composting process that you're controlling on farm, keeping those records for that composting process.
All right, so again, hitting the high points, the key things that we must document, there's that must instead of should, is the times, the temperatures, the turnings, and the other processing steps that you might include.
Again, at the end of your packet here, we actually have the 3 logs that have been developed by the Cornell Good Agricultural Practices Decision Trees team, of which Annette was a part of. This is just the example one of the compost processing log. You can tell the things that they've captured there are the name of the farm, the type of composting method, so if you're using a windrow system as opposed to a static system, the date it was actually piled, and then the date finished, and the row number, if you have several windrows all together, being able to differentiate one from the other. The things they're actually capturing within the chart there are things such as the date turn, the temperature in the test area 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Again, getting multiple regions within that windrow system to make sure you're reaching that 131 or higher. And then in essence, since this is a windrow system, how many times where we're having to turn it, how many times are we going to have to record this data? Anyone?
3
3
days.
days, and then you need to show that.
How many times do you have to turn it?
How many times?
5 times,
You
yes,
have
you
to
should
turn
have
it 5 times.
5 entries there at least, and you can take the temperature more than that.
Yeah, and you're going
Daily.
to show the bookends of those 3 days. So
Yep.
have it at the start of 3 days, and then at the end of the 3 days, turn it, demonstrate that again.
And while this example shows things that are all over 131, this shows why you want to take multiple readings of that pile. You might have one that's 130 or 129, and if that's the only one you're going off of, technically you wouldn't be within that window. But if you have 4 readings and you have one that's 130, but the rest are 135 and 140, you can have pretty good confidence that you're actually above that 131, and you're not just going off of one reading. The other thing that's important here is list all the ingredients added to your compost. So again, this record is as much for you as anybody else if, heaven forbid, there should be an outbreak associated with your farm. And this is something that can give people clues. If they know exactly what's in your compost, and if you know exactly what's in that pile, you might be making multiple piles, and you might have different ingredients for different piles just because you're experimenting with what's the best recipe or what's available to you at that time. So the more information you can include there in the ingredient list, the better off you'll be, both from a production standpoint again and the food safety side. Because if you put something in there and it really doesn't work in your pile, you don't like the final product, you could say, oh, it was that whatever you put in there that we didn't use before, and I'm not going to put that in anymore. So again, it's as much for production as food safety.
So, hopefully, again, what temperature do we need to reach to negate foodborne pathogens? 131. And if we have a static pile where we're getting that temperature all throughout the pile, 3 days is all we have to hit for. However, many, especially small and medium farms, are going to be turning that pile, in which case you're not getting even temperature distribution, and you need to actually turn it a minimum of 5 times, and you're going to be hitting, as you're turning your aerating, you're going to maintain that thermophilic phase. So in essence, 3 days, 5 times over, so typically a 15-day process is what you're going to be looking at.
When you turn it, does the temperature go down?
Usually you're able to maintain it because although momentarily you're putting what's on the outside, which is at a lower temperature in, it heats up really quickly. So it doesn't take very long at all to actually recover and maintain. You'll see small dips if you're monitoring the temperature continuously, but it's not a lot. Again, for foodborne pathogens, temperature is going to be key for inactivation, but other record-keeping aspects, as Annette was mentioning, is also important, such as what are the components, especially for those chemical hazards, which could rear their ugly head, especially related to production and things along those lines. And it'll be nice for you to be able to trace that back if you do start to have issues and try and troubleshoot where that came from. Again, everybody hates record keeping, but at the end of the day, you can't always rely on your memory. I mean, I know, especially doing so much and trying to multitask so much, it's really hard to keep track of it. So it's really nice to have that written down, even though it does take a little bit of extra effort.